and at university level. And in both contexts, assessment has always, personally for me, been a way not only to gauge what has been done, but it's actually a way to learn. And that is why I'm not going to talk too much about this, but when we talk about renewable assessment, this is actually one of the most optimum ways of assessing for the sake of learning and not assessing for the sake of assessing. But I will today just cover some theoretical concepts around renewable assessment. I will share some broad descriptions and some of the definitions that are out there. And then I will close by covering two specific cases where we've used a renewable assessment within a teaching and learning context. So I hope this will be of value. I will keep my eye on the chat. So if there's any comments as I go along, you are welcome to just make a note in the chat. Otherwise, we will handle the questions at the end. And once again, if at any point I'm not audible or you can't see, then just let me know also about the chat. So, dear colleagues, I like starting with an image, and this is what comes to mind when we talk about renewable assessments, and that is the idea of disposable assessments. I will say a little bit more of how David Wiley and the colleagues who came up with this idea define it, but in short, a lot of the assessments we let our students do actually lands up in the bin. And, in the sense of the students spend a lot of time creating the assessments. Sometimes they have a peer also reading it. Sometimes at least they read it a couple of times. And then it's submitted to a teacher, and the teacher reads it, assigns a mark, and that's where the life of that assessment ends. And the idea of renewable assessments is that actually a lot of that content, and you can think how much content is generated by you and others, what happens to that? It ends there. It's not used again. And actually, that could be a nice resource in itself. And it can be as limited as being reused in the class. But what I'm talking about today as well is the idea of that resource being used for the benefit of others as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Now, you are all in education, so you might know this also better than me. We have to situate what we do in teaching in some sort of the theory. And for me, it's mainly constructivism and social constructivism specifically, because we learn through others, but also through the creation process. And this is what you do quite often with assessments. So it's all about students creating or constructing knowledge. Importantly, we here look at learning being collaborative and being negotiated from multiple perspectives. So when we talk about renewable assessments, also keep in mind that could be collaborative activity. So students working together in creating an assessment artifact. Now, this is not something new. If you look at the work of Vygotsky, he already noted how children learn through that social interaction and how social and cultural aspects play into the learning process. Garrison and Anderson, they specifically talked about this personal meaning making or the social influence. I love the idea of the personal meaning making as being central to the collaborative constructivist approach, because for me, learning is language, learning is communication. So it's all about meaning making. And that is central to renewable assessments as well. Also here, it's about socially constructed meaning and within a social context. I want to extend that idea even further. Now, Holmes and Gardner have written quite a number of interesting things around social constructivism, and that underpins what renewable assessment is all about. But social constructivism, according to Holmes and others, is a process by which students make learning, or make meaning rather, and a central role the community through culture and language plays in this process. So for them also, it's a very lingual process. It's learning that includes elements of social prompts reflection and has elements of authenticity. I want to move to the other term that Holmes uses, and I know in some areas in the word communal has got different meanings, but in this instance, communal constructivism refers to constructivism for the sake of the community. So it's a very specific definition of the word communal here. So keep in mind that it comes from their frame of reference. And here it refers to an approach to learning which students not only construct their own knowledge, so this is nothing new, we see that always, but it's also interacting with the environment, but actively being engaged in the process of constructing knowledge for the learning community. So it goes out. So creating artifacts that can not just be used by the students doing the assessment, but also by other students and ultimately the wider community if that is relevant. And that is where I'm aiming for. So you have to view what I'm going to talk about today in terms of a couple of things. The social constructivist, or extended to the communal constructivist view. You have to view it in terms of self-directed learning. I see learning as being optimal if it's self-directed. And then finally, also considering open educational resources. So keep that in mind. So the whole idea of open licenses, open sharing. I want to also frame this in terms of access. I will share the link to some of the resources I referred to, and I will also share with you all the slides at the end. But this one specifically comes from a book that we published a couple of years ago. And there I distinguished between different levels of access. And this is highly relevant for higher education, but to an extent it also would be pertinent to a school. But apart from having devices or having access to a school, having access to a teacher, that formal access, there's also that level of being able to understand. And finally, also being able to select resources. But more importantly for me, is getting to a point where students actually have what I term there as demiurgic access, being able to create new knowledge for the common good. And you can even start this at school, even though the two cases I will refer to today are actually within the university context. So we must see how we can actually empower our students to move to that level of access as well. But yes, if you want to read more, you're welcome to do so in that chapter. And I have referred to this in a couple of other places. As I mentioned, for me, it's all about student agency, and getting students to work collaboratively on renewable assessments is really a good way of promoting self-directed learning. But very shortly, what I mean with that, in the sense of what Malcolm Knowles says, it's a process in which individuals take the initiative with or without others. So it can be collaborative exercise in identifying the needs, formulating goals, and very importantly, identifying these resources. And quite often these resources can be renewable assessments in themselves. And then also finally choosing the right strategies and evaluating learning outcomes. So this is how I view self-directed learning. And as I said, this also underpins the way I view learning and the way that we actually would approach renewable assessments. The other issue I mentioned just now as being relevant is open education. And you might know open educational resources already, but the idea behind that is teaching and learning, teaching, and research materials that are openly licensed, that can be reused, that are there at no cost. And that is where I'm aiming to. So you can already reflect how would you gauge your assessment that can actually become an OER in itself. And the process that is highly relevant here is contextualization and localization. And quite often that in itself can be the exercise. If you are, for example, in teacher training, that is the kind of things I would want my students to be able to do, to take a resource that is available online, even if it's created by ChatGPT, if needs be, and then contextualize that for their world. The part where they stay in whichever country, and specifically even for their class, because they know what the needs might be in terms of their classes or their potential classes. And this arcs back to the older ideas of what is associated with open pedagogy, of it promoting autonomy and interdependence, freedom and responsibility, and also the democracy of participation, which is a highly important in an open view. So if I can quickly pause here for a second and ask if you can maybe give a sense in the chat, if you had to guess what renewable assessment would be, if you can please just jot down, if you have to guess, what is renewable assessment? So just jot down what you think renewable assessment is all about. I'm going to add the question in the chat as well, and please respond quickly. What do you think renewable assessment means? So whilst I am busy, I'm going to do one more slide, and then I'll share some of the other views of what renewable assessment means. So in the chat, just briefly, a couple of words, 5 or 6 words, just what do you think? What do you think is renewable assessment? So again, renewable assessment, I view it in terms of open educational resources, but also open pedagogy. Open pedagogy, as you will notice here, it relates a lot to the way in which we apply, use, and value open educational resources within the educational context. So I don't see any replies yet in the chat. So please, colleagues, you're welcome to quickly write down what do you think renewable assessment means for you. Okay, so open pedagogy, David Wiley, John Hilton, they specifically say that open pedagogy is the set of teaching and learning practices that are only possible or practical in the context of 5R permissions. The 5R permissions, that's a very interesting part of OERs, and you're welcome to maybe Google that and read a bit more on what Wiley says about the 5R. And there's been suggestions of adding extras. I've also suggested recontextualization as one of them. But in short, it's reuse, retain, revise, remix, and redistribute. That's the 5 R's that they refer to there. And that relates to the licenses linked to a resource. So in other words, if you've got a textbook, if you've got a text, if you've got an assessment and you share it online, you add a license. If I can show you quickly, I'm going to move back to the first slide. You can see on the top left-hand side part of the screen, I've indicated the license there that this set of presentations are licensed as CC by SA. In other words, you can use it as long as you acknowledge me, and you have to share it with the same license. Otherwise, you can do with the slides what you like. And so that's where it relates to the 5R permissions. For Cronin, and you can definitely, if there's one author you look up after this talk, it must be Cronin. She's written wonderful work on open pedagogy and open educational practices. And she specifically calls this collaborative practices that include the creation, use, and reuse of OERs, as well as pedagogical practices employing participatory technology. So you can hear the whole time, it's all the social constructivist ideas of getting the students to work together in the learning process. And the social networks for interaction, peer learning, knowledge creation, and empowerment of learners. It's so essential. We tend to, and I come from an environment where we also had at university level very big classes, going up to 300 students per class, and then it's quite difficult, especially if it's a hybrid class, both contact and distance students, to get them to work collaboratively. And you have to be very creative in picking your technologies, using things like wikis or even Google Docs to let them collaborate, even though they might not be in the same physical space. We saw some interesting approaches to this during COVID pandemic as well. How do you get the students to actually collaborate where the opportunities are not that easy? And we even there saw a wonderful work being done, even using WhatsApp and platforms like that. So don't let the distance and the technology be the hindrance, but let collaborative practice be the guiding element here. I see there's quite a number of messages coming in. I'm going to take a look at it now. But in short, open pedagogy relates to using OERs. it also involves adapting OERs, and I'm almost getting to renewable assessments, and also relates to creating OERs, and that this is on the side of the student. But we have to empower students to be able to adapt or create these open educational resources. And that starts by us as teachers knowing um, what OERs are and even creating it in ourselves. Um, and this is where the whole idea of disposable and renewable assignments comes very much to the fore, because once you get students to understand the copyright issues around educational resources, to understand what the licenses imply, and as I say, especially with student teachers, but this applies to any student, you can actually let them create these resources. And also the advocacy element is essential within any educational context. So on my next slide, I will quickly look at the issue of this renewable and disposable assignments and or assessments. And I want to ask, first of all, for you to reflect on this. You don't need to write how many people will read your students' assessments and will they be used again. But let me see what you've written down. I see there's quite a number of responses after my question. Let me see. Um, someone says, Smal Gandhi, this is useful outside of the classroom environment. Yes, very important. When we talk about renewable assessments, it's good to think to what extent we can move the use of those assignments or assessments beyond merely for my own students, but to the community. Not always that easy, but it's possible. Probably a kind of assessment which is created for the purpose of sharing with the community so it can be used over and over again, said Dr. Deepti Chopra. Yeah, I totally agree. It's about that reuse. Lalit Chopra says that we can use after grading. Very important. We get stuck, and quite often it's the manager's fault, not and the system's fault, not the teacher's fault, that it's all about the grading. And remember, we are not in education to assign marks, but to actually ensure learning takes place. And there's a bit always that tension between that. So Lalit, thank you for that comment. Can be used again with value and changes, says Tapashi Saha. Dr. Sandeep Paul says encouraging academic integrity outside and inside the classroom. Very important. Dr. Sandeep, I cannot emphasize that enough. I think I do mention it a little bit later in the slides. But when we talk about renewable assessments, we also have to talk about issues around plagiarism, because that and copyright goes hand in hand. Because once you share something with an open license, it doesn't imply anyone can take the information and reuse without any responsibility. You still have to give acknowledgement if you use a proper license. And students need to know, what can I reuse ethically and correctly, and what might be plagiarism. So Banya Mishra says it's a form of assessments to add value to the things done outside the classroom. Yes, that's an interesting view. I think one can bring that in, getting students to look at authentic cases, but that will be very discipline specific. Vasanti sent me direct message, a renewable assessment is a form of assessment that adds value to the world outside of classroom. Yes, 100%. I totally agree there. So I see there are some interesting views here, and I'm really glad that you shared your view. But let's see, from the point of view of David Wiley, who started with this idea in a mainstream, how does he and colleagues distinguish between disposable and renewable assessments? And that's probably the most important slide, and you can read more on his blog about this. A disposable assignment is any assignment about which students and faculty understand the following. Students will do the work, faculty, the teachers will grade the work, and students will throw away the work. So that's disposable assignments, and the majority of assignments worldwide are done like that. Take note that David Wiley and them, they refer to this as renewable assignments. I use the word renewable assessments to be a bit more inclusive and cover many more activities than merely assignments. You can see there that David Wiley notes that a reasonable estimate is that US undergraduate students spend about 40 million hours on these kind of assignments. So that's 40 million hours spent on something that will just give you a mark and then will be nothing for the rest of society. Think how many hours and how many resources we can actually generate that can be reused by others, in changing that 40 million hours into creating renewable assignments, not keeping it as disposable. So a renewable assignment, according to Wiley, is any assignment where the students will do the work, faculty will grade the work, it's still fine, but then the work is inherently valuable to someone beyond the class. So it might be someone in next year's class. It might be someone in another class. Or like it says here, it's openly published. So it can be of value to anyone. It might be someone from a different level of teaching. It might be someone from a different country or institution even. So that's where the value lies. And that makes it closer to what I referred to as earlier as the communal constructivism, that thing that whatever is created is to the benefit of the community, and not just for the class and the mark ultimately. So Wiley and Hilton, they defined renewable assignments as follows: assignments which both support an individual student's learning, yes, that is not normal, and result in new or improved open education resources that provide a lasting benefit to the broader community of learners. So it becomes something that others can benefit from as well. And it goes beyond something just being read by the lecturer or the teacher. There's been a number of studies where this has been done at university level, at college level, not so many in school level, but I think ultimately even there, it is possible to get school level students involved in creating resources that can be of benefit. Because many of them are doing it already. They are generating a lot of content that is shared online through social media, through different platforms. And we as teachers need to nurture ethical practices when sharing content online. And this is a very good opportunity to do that. But that puts the emphasis on teachers to actually be empowered in being able to understand how licensing work and how resources can be shared. Wiley and Hilton admits that this can actually lead to the creation of contextualized OER, and I think that's the biggest value, and that is what we need, especially now in a changing world. More resources that are contextualized. I am a big supporter of localized and localization when it comes to OERs, because any resource cannot merely be generic. So what is appropriate in South Africa will not be appropriate in Canada, would not be appropriate in any other country. As is, one would always want to add specific examples, specific cases, and so on. And I will show that in a moment when I talk about the two case studies we had. So these assignments, the assessments, should provide a learning benefit to the student and result in OER. Katz and Van Allen show an interesting approach to localizing and then moving towards a renewable assignment. So it might be interesting read to look at how they suggest, but I will show you how I would suggest we approach that in a moment. Important questions we need to ask ourselves at this point. Say you are a teacher and you want to implement renewable assessments. How do you ensure the quality of shared renewable assessments? And typically I would suggest here within the context of open education that you start with the peers. So students will need to check each other's work before it is submitted for marks. That's a good step. A further level of quality control can be the teacher themselves. So teachers can play a very important role in giving guidance to students towards getting the quality up to standard of that assessment so that it can be published as an OER. A couple of practical things here. At the Commonwealth of Learning, we support a lot of policy work and implementation framework work in terms of open educational resources. And quite often in open educational resource policies for schools, colleges, universities, there are actually additional quality levels built in, so university would say, or a college would say, any OER published within this institution will have to go through a specific departmental or faculty committee also, or it needs to be signed off by a lecturer. So there might be additional quality steps built in, and you will have to just clarify that within your institution. And if there's nothing, maybe start off with some sort of a process. That's the one thing. The other thing I want to mention that I didn't add there in the questions is, remember, as a lecturer, as a teacher, you cannot compel students to share their work online. It will always have to be an opt-in, opt-out situation. So I would, in the past, what we've done at my former institution where we used this, we would get all the students to do the assessments, but at the end, they will have to give their consent for it to be shared online. And usually we would actually empower them and teach them how it can be done, and then it's up to them to share it online or not. But the majority of students always want to do that because they see the value in, and that's where the advocacy comes in. But please do keep in mind it is not something that you can compel them to share it online. You can compel them to do it because they're getting marks, but the sharing is usually another matter. A further issue that we need to consider is that how many times can we actually recycle these artifacts? It cannot be done again and again and again. Say, for example, one typical way of doing renewable assessments is getting students to write an open textbook. This is what David Wiley does. He gets his students together. Usually with older students, you will not use it for first years, for example, at university. You might do it with third years. You get them to co-write the textbook to be used in the classroom with you as lecturer. And David Wiley has done it very successfully for many years. But you can think for yourself too, to what extent can you literally rewrite the textbook every year? So my sense would be that one would mix it up. So in year one of your trial of this, for example, you can get the students to write the textbook. Year two, you can get them to revise it. Year three, you can actually let them start afresh, remixing and adding specific case studies. And then I would typically stop for a while, use that textbook and then maybe go through the cycle again. So do keep in mind that this cannot be done ad infinitum. You would usually do it for a while. Open publication or not, once again, that is up to you as teacher, whether you will definitely share it openly or maybe just internally within a university's repository. Who owns the artifacts? That's an interesting question. For most countries, looking at copyright, if a student has created an artifact and their name is on that, then automatically they can claim the copyright of that. You don't need to apply for it. It happens automatically. And that's why it's essential for the students to understand what is theirs and what is something that they can share, what they can reuse. And that's why licensing is important, that a name is added and you add the licensing details. I have seen in some cases students say that they don't want to share this as their artifact because that is linked, once you've uploaded on the internet, it's there forever. And that is linked to them then forever. So at my former institution, we always created the option that if you want to publish it anonymously, you can add the institution's name. So that's a possibility as well. Or they can just merely share it anonymously. So that is also not an issue. But for most institutions, that would be the option because your policies would allow for that. And I know many institutions, students actually sign when they register that any intellectual artifacts that they create the university can claim if there's funding that can come from that, and that needs to be negotiated with the students. So a university or a lecturer or teacher cannot merely take an assessment and publish it themselves and say this is ours. There needs to be that negotiation with the original creator, but all of that depends on your OER policy or IP policy, etc. Then the last thing I already mentioned is plagiarism. It's very important to alert students about the issues around plagiarism. And these days, also the issues around content being created by artificial intelligence, language models, things like ChatGPT. And that's why it's so important for us to model ethical behavior in terms of that, but also inform students that when we reuse content, we do it in a very ethical and responsible way. And that in the academic sphere, we do that quite often. We do reuse content, but then we give credit through citations to where we've gotten the information from. So be also careful in reusing copyrighted material. If it's not openly licensed, it might be problematic in using it as is. Similarly, remember in open education, one of our big mottos is we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So, and we also want to teach that to students, that if something is available content-wise with an open license, we can reuse that without having to start from scratch. Although my personal feeling is when it comes to students, we can get them to do that, some of the content originally as well. It's not so much an issue for them. So I'm moving to the case studies in a moment. All of this we have to see within the broader frame of open educational practices. And as I stated right at the start, it's very much linked to self-directed learning. So I've got two cases that I want to briefly tell you about, and this is things that I've done in class or colleagues have done in class to create renewable assessments. And the first one was specifically videos for specific terms and concepts. And here I explored short instructional videos, and one can even extend it to micro videos, so very, very short videos. And getting students to actually use their own devices. That was part of the research that I did here, was to actually find out to what extent that would be better than students using, sets, the same kind of device or computers or whatever. So here I allowed them to use, whether they wanted to use phones or computers, whatever. And all the students, even some of the students with little access to technology, were able to do this. And I encouraged them to do it in groups, but they had the choice to do it individually or in groups. So in essence, what they did, each of the students took a term or a phrase from a list of all the key terms from this subject, and they had to create a short video or animation. I gave them that option as well on that topic to explain it, and we uploaded that on YouTube. And this was specifically in the language Afrikaans. So not only did we create a lot of resources that can be reused by teachers or anyone interested in this field, but we've also extended resources being available in this language. So one way of approaching this would be to, first of all, let the students review existing videos. So if there's anything that can reuse, they can do that. And so that they can get a sense of what it can be entail. Then creating some groups or giving them the opportunities to opt to do it individually. I think I told them not more than 3, if I can recall correctly. But there were, I think, 1 or 2 groups that are slightly more. But there were also individuals doing this. Then going through the script writing or storyboarding, because it was essential for them to do the planning, and understanding what this entails. And specifically here, one would also do some capacity building around licenses. To evaluate what has been done, and that's typically where the peer review comes in, or the teacher review, and then it's published online. Quite often, one would, apart from all of this, then go back and review the videos in the next year. All of this happens within a broader sphere or a learning ecosystem that is very multimodal. So it's all about, in this case, students understanding how videos work. So that brings in an interesting element to the process, but also them being able to independently work in creating these resources and then sharing it as a micro-learning object. You're welcome to read a bit more about this if you want. The links will be available in the presentation I will share afterwards. The second case study was specifically in African languages. So sorry, these are two language examples, but you can use the same, like the videos can be done in any subject. In this case, our aim was to create texts, and this was specifically comprehension test, text and questions by the student teachers in under-resourced languages. But there was, again, that additional element that came in. So what is significant about this case is that students were busy with something they would have done in any case. So they are training to become language teachers, so they have to create comprehension tests, so getting a text and writing some questions. So we wanted them to create original texts, and that was really a bit of a challenge, but the students really enjoyed that creative part of creating a text, and a text that then will be published online with questions, with a memoranda, which can then not just be reused by other students for learning purposes, but importantly, our aim was for these resources to be available for teachers in practice. Since these are language teachers, it was easy for them. They've got a very strong language background, so they were good in creating appropriate text, although we had to check the language and ensure the quality as well. So in this case, the recipe I would suggest, and one can vary this, of course, is looking at the curriculum and content, preparing the students, again, about things like instructional design, information literacy, licensing, very important, and then, of course, content, getting them to create the OERs. So they look for existing content. In this project, there were none, so that we skipped. But then also for them to understand what it means to retain, reuse, revise, and remix, and that their content can also be used in that sense. Finally, there's the evaluation and refinement, and then the sharing of the information online. And this can, if you want to read more about this specific research, you can look at this book. I'm going to add the link there for the whole series. All those books, of course, are openly licensed, so you can download it and share it for free. And all those books relate to self-directed learning, but if you look at this one specifically, there's emphasis on blended learning interventions, and the one was the one we did with the renewable assessments. A couple of recommendations before I finish up. Many assessments can be transformed from disposable to being renewable. So think any of the traditional assessments you were planning, to what extent can you actually reuse that, or to what extent can that be shared outside? Teachers should consider different motivating factors. Actually, the sharing, the advocacy of openness can act as a motivating factor, and I've seen it in both these cases when it comes to students. Students are often career-focused, and this prompts a need for authentic content. So when we talk about assessment, assessment needs to be authentic. It must relate to what you are training the students to become. So if it's teachers, it must be something that they could practically use in the classroom. If it's another field, then to what extent do you think your assessment is authentic and relates to the real world of the students and their career one day? Students should be supported and allowed to structure and manage their own learning. So very important, giving them the tools, empowering them, and then letting them run the process. So the assessment itself should be supportive of self-directed learning. Time management, we've seen, is an important issue, especially for our distance students in the research for the two cases I mentioned. But not all students feel confident in selecting their own strategies, and that should be facilitated. So quite often you will have to, as a teacher, scaffold the process and empower them. Monitoring of learning should be scaffolded, as I said there, from lecturers to students. So moving from a teacher-centered approach more to a student-centered approach is also valuable when we talk about renewable assignments. In conclusion, renewable assessments is a very good open educational practice, and it might be sensible for you to also become self-directed in terms of this and read up on the types of examples you get. It can be open textbooks, it can be students creating a journal or a magazine, it can be students creating artifacts from their own environment, taking pictures, creating something online. Say if it's the subject is tourism or something similar to that. It could be students creating assessments. I've done this also once, where students actually created the mock examination papers because they have covered the information. Very recently, and this was published at the beginning of this year, although the publication date is 2022, we had a whole program of promoting open educational resources at Northwest University, and where a number of lecturers were supported to create or empower their students to create OERs. We had music students creating music pieces that can be reused. We had a journalism class where the journalism students with the lecturer created a journalism textbook that is aimed at a South African audience. And that is available freely online now. So please do check on that book. This book is totally open license, so you can do whatever you want with it, even take parts of it if you want to use it for teaching and learning purposes. But there's a strong emphasis on renewable assessments there. I'm almost finishing up. We should draw on the affordance of getting students involved in creating resources for reuse. So students want to take part and they want to share. And this is an optimum form of assessment as learning, not assessment of or for learning, but the assessment itself is the learning process, especially in a collaborative context. Very important if you can facilitate that. And we need to empower teachers and students to work with renewable assessments. And when we say within the context of open education, to understand what the open licenses mean. And with that, I want to say thank you very much once again. Over to you, Dr. Batra. I don't know whether there's any questions at this point. I will share the link in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful presentation. It is really thought-provoking presentation, and you clearly make us clear to understand about what renewal assessments are and how we can use them as open education resources, or how we can create the OERs for other students, or how we can empower teachers and students. So thank you so much. And we have Dr. Kiran Lata Danwal with us, and many other teachers too. So I request all the participants, if you have any,
थैंक यू कमेंट में लिख
if
दो
you have
कमेंट
any
कमेंट में
question,
थैंक यू लिख दो
uh,
अरे वॉइस बंद की हुई है थैंक
I
यू लिख दो
request
बस आप
participants, please mute. If you have any question, then only please unmute. If you have any question, please unmute yourself.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
I just wanted to ask, I mean, I was really listening into it, and being a faculty from a teacher education, we have started with a lot of innovative works like, children writing magazines, and we are starting with making them, come up with research work, with small work. So I was very interested on what Sir Jacob talked about, writing books. So my question is, I am from Northeast India, where we need to really, train our children. And so instead of one semester, we have it in a semester system, one semester writing a book. If we could do this way, like we make them write maybe a few chapters, and the next semester builds up on it, revised, like what you talked about, peer group also. So can that be done that way about the renewable assessments or assignments? Can that be one way of doing it?
Thank you, Tapashi Sir. Thank you, Dr. Batra. Yes, definitely. The idea of creating a book is very, very good. And the book itself could be the incentive for the students to do that, So now I would definitely categorize this as a good example of a renewable assignment or renewable assessment. Key to this would then be what are they writing? Are they writing chapters in the book? Are we talking about something that's fiction or not fiction? So that will also have an influence on where you would publish this. See, with open educational resources, quite often our aim is not necessarily to get this printed because that also will bring in some additional costs, and that is sometimes problematic. So at least the bottom line would be to at least have it published online, and there are so many platforms. So I would say, in doing this, find an appropriate repository, whether it's archive.org or whether it's there's one called Merlot. So find a repository that's suitable for this. You know, when we talk about fiction in South Africa, we've got the African Storybook, which is one approach that shows you how you can share creative works very easily. But yes, from my side, it's definitely a renewable assessment. Please run with it. It sounds like a very good idea, and it could also prove to present a lot of interesting research opportunities. But yes, that sounds good.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you, ma'am. Any other questions? I request the participants, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself, or you can type your question in the chat.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Sandeep, sir. Yes. Thank you, sir.
My question for our resource person is that he has mentioned self-directed learning. So, sir, Jaco sir, how we develop or promote self-directed learning among students? And my next question related to this is that when we develop the self-directed learning among students, and what are the strategies to assess the self-directed learning of students?
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep Paul. Can you maybe repeat the first question? I caught the second one, but the first one, there was a noise. Can you just repeat that again?
My question is that, sir, how we promote or develop self-directed learning among students?
Okay. Yes, that's actually a question that warrants a whole separate presentation, and I would gladly do that if there's interest. But yes, in short, self-directed learning, it's inherent to human beings. We want to learn self-directedly in normal circumstances. When you're born, you do that because you want to learn how to walk, you want to learn how to speak. But once we get to school and to a certain age, we tend to lose that kind of incentive to learn, because this is a totally environment, and quite often the teaching is structured in another way than you would want to learn. So that is one thing. So even from the lowest level of school, teachers actually need to promote strategies that support self-directed learning, and they involve active learning. So it's not what I've been doing today. I'm speaking and you sitting there and listen. So that's not good for self-directed learning. It should be, or it could be, collaborative and cooperative strategies. The one is more structured than the other, but getting students to work together. It could be problem-based learning. So setting a specific problem. It can be an unstructured problem, and getting students to work through that problem to get to a solution. That supports self-directed learning. And that you can start, as I say, at the lowest level of school, and it can run all the way through school, university, college, even for professional development. You must promote strategies that engage self-directed learning. You want when someone is done with studies to actually say, but I need to know more about this, and then they teach themselves more about that. That's the one thing. I think the second question you mentioned, that how do we measure this? There are many tools. The one that I will share with you, and you can use it as a questionnaire with your students, is the Williamson questionnaire for self-directed learning. It's actually the self-rating scale for self-directed learning. So this is one way, and you can actually use this for research. But I mean, if you just want to get a sense and get your students to get a sense, let me just type that there. There's the link. Then that can be used to gauge to what extent you are self-directed. One last thing I want to mention, remember, self-directed learning is very much dependent on the discipline. So you can't say I'm a self-directed learning, I'm always self-directed. You will be self-directed learning in learner in a specific subject at a specific time. So I know myself, I wasn't as self-directed when it comes to mathematics than, say, for example, history, because I had an interest in history, so it was easier for me to be self-directed. I read a lot more. When it comes to mathematics, I only did what I had to do. So keep in mind that that also varies between students and between contexts. So I hope I answered your questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep, and thank you, Dr. Chitu. Any other questions, please? I think someone raised their hand. So I again request the participants, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and ask the question. We received so many resources from our resource person. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing these wonderful resources. So I think no more questions are there. So we have our principal, Dr. Janak Mehta, with us. And so one question in the chat box. How to ensure authentic and transparent assessment of renewable assignments?
Very good question. Thank you, Gyanu Gurung. In short, authentic for me means the assessment needs to relate to the context of the students, number one. So you cannot merely ask students or reuse, for example, assessment from the US in another context. So it's about that, all the contextual factors, the geographical, the cultural. You can even consider things about religious. There's so many aspects, linguistic, etc., elements that must be aligned with the world in which the students function. That's the one thing. So related to the actual world. Secondly, assessments can become more authentic if it's related to the discipline. So if you're training teachers, the assessment must relate to teachers. If you're training engineers, the assessment must relate to engineers, not, say, for example, merely generic mathematics. So the closer you bring it to the job that they might ultimately be one day, the more authentic it will be. The transparency for me comes in number one, having all the steps clear to students from the start, showing them how you will be assessing, showing where, at which points they will get feedback. And the extreme form of making it transparent would actually be involving students in setting up that process. So if there's going to be a rubric that assesses the OER that they are creating, whether it's a textbook, whether it's a video, get the students to co-write the rubric with you as teacher. And then everything is transparent and they actually feel that they are part of the process. It really promotes student agency and it really promotes self-directed learning on the side of the students as well. So yes, very important two aspects. And I would definitely suggest and recommend that whenever you're approaching assessments, whether it's renewable or not, that they are authentic and that they are transparent. So yes, very important point you've made. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. One more question. Are there any emerging trends or advancements in the renewable assessment that students should be aware of? Like you had mentioned earlier, the ethical considerations and all that.
Definitely. I think that's also an interesting question. The biggest thing currently in renewable assessment is two things. The whole issue of adaptable or adaptive learning, so that learning is customized to the individual's needs. So your learning management systems built on data, and they actually give different assignments to different students based on what they know and what they need. That's the one element, that customization, individualization of learning based on data. And the other big thing is artificial intelligence. So I foresee that a lot of work on renewable assessments will involve artificial intelligence systems. things like Chat GPT in future, where students will be using tools like that to create OERs. There are some questions about copyright when it comes to that right now, and very few countries have got answers, legally, in terms of where do we, who's the copyright holder. If you're giving prompts, you are sharing some of your intellectual property. So tricky one, but yes, the two emerging trends, and you can especially for students, alert them to that, is that learning is becoming, or there's a need for it to be more individualized, and then also the affordances and the challenges and the dangers of using artificial intelligence in this regard as well. So that would be the two things I would want to mention.
Thank you, sir. One question. Please tell about some techniques which can be used to empower our teachers and students to prepare renewable assignments. Please.
Okay. Thank you.
Answer is, I think, already
Dr.
given by. Yes.
Yes, I see that question, Rajni Bala. Thank you, Doctor. In short, the techniques that I would suggest are some of the things I showed in those graphs. It's preparing the students in terms of licenses. So making sure that they understand what open licenses are. And it starts with you as a teacher knowing what the licenses imply. And then also empowering the students in terms of the technology to be used. If it's merely a text-based thing that you're creating, then if you are using a collaborative space like a wiki or Google Docs or something similar, it's showing the students how it works and showing them how to collaborate, giving them ground rules, negotiating that with them. That would be one of the steps you would want to take. In terms of broader techniques, I would definitely say explore how cooperative learning works. That one of the earlier links I shared with the self-directed learning books, there are a lot of examples there, very practical on how you can approach cooperative learning. So that would be a very important technique that you will have to cover and master as a teacher, first of all, how to do that, how to set up your groups, how to get them to do the evaluation between themselves, and so on. So that would be my short answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajni ma'am, and thank you, Jyoti sir, for answering all the questions so clearly. Thank you so much. I think no more questions are there. So now I would like to invite Dr. Kiranlata Danwan. Uh, she is the co-developer of MOOC on alternative assessment with me. So thank you, ma'am, for joining. And now I would like to invite you for formal thanks for Dr. Jitsu. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Kavita. I hope I am audible.
Yes, ma'am, you are clearly audible.
Okay. Thank you so much. And as we come to the end of the today's session on assessment on open practice from responsible to renewable assessment. So I would like to express my sincere appreciation to Dr. Jacko Oliver for his enlightening presentation and valuable insights. We are truly grateful for the knowledge and expertise he has shared with us today. And throughout the session, we have explored the principles and practices of renewable assessment and emphasizing the shift from one-time disposable assessment to approaches that support ongoing learning and engagement. So Dr. Oliver has provided us with a deeper understanding of the strategies, tools, and considerations involved in implementing renewable assessment practices. I hope that this session has sparked new ideas and perspectives, inspiring all the participants to explore and adopt renewable assessment practices on your own in your educational context. So by embracing these assessment strategies, we can foster a culture of continuous learning, empower our students, and create opportunities for growth and improvement. I would also like to extend my gratitude to all the participants for your active engagement throughout the questions, the valuable contributions throughout the session, and especially your so good questions from the resource person. Your enthusiasm and dedication to the advancing assessment practices are commendable. As we conclude today's session, I encourage you to continue the conversation and further explore the resources and tools shared during the session. Let us apply the knowledge gained today to our teaching and learning process and assessment practices, striving for meaningful and renewable assessment approaches that enhance students' learning and development. Once again, I express my sincere appreciation to Dr. Jacko Oliver for his time, expertise, and inspiring presentation. I also extend my gratitude to Dr. Kavita for coordinating this session and for making this session possible, especially because she is doing hard work for each and everything for running this smooth. So thank you all, those who have participated in, and I wish you to continue success in your journey towards the implementing this particular assessment practices. And my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Narendra Kumar, who is the main course developer of this course. And once again, thanks to everyone, those who are associated with this move. And once again, thank you to Dr. Jacko, and looking forward for more and more collaboration with you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. All the best. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you once again, Dr. Jethro, for sharing such an expertise or such a wonderful session it was. Thank you once again. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.